Hello everyone, bringing you a video today talking about the British Army's DPM Tropical Combat Uniform, the jacket for which we have here on the mannequin. We're going to talk about the trousers from this uniform as well and the hat later on in the video. The uniform was introduced in the mid-1970s, it was trialled in the early 1970s. By the early 1970s, the British Army had a need for a new combat clothing for wear in the tropics. The existing uniforms were basically developed from Second War practice with jungle green trousers and cellular bush jackets and shirts. So the uniform, the technology had moved on in terms of materials and so forth, and obviously camouflage print. So there was a need to move away from plain green clothing and to polycotton, which is what we have here, which is quicker drying. It does have some disadvantages, but it's quicker drying and harder wearing than the cellular uniform items which had been issued, the bush jackets and shirts that had been issued prior to this. So this uniform, trialled in the early 1970s, was accepted and introduced around 1975 into 1976, around that time, basically the mid-1970s. Proved very popular. The trousers in particular turn up in temperate climes as well because they're very quick drying and a lot lighter weight than the heavier weight temperate DPM combat clothing, which was around at the time, which of course had been derived from the cold weather uniform worn in Korea, was therefore very heavy weight. So the tropical trousers in particular were also popular for wear in more temperate climes as well, if you could get away with it and if you had access to them. So that's something that does show up in photographs from the time as well, is the tropical trousers in particular do show up in Northern Ireland, for example, and on exercise in Germany on occasion as well. So we're going to talk about the jacket. This is a shirt, I suppose, in terms of the actual layout and the design, but it is termed a jacket officially, and that's what we'll refer to it as in the video. And we're going to have a look at the trousers as well and the hat, as I say. So we'll start with the jacket as we have it on the mannequin here and talk about some of the various design features of this. The design of the uniform is very lightweight. It's a very thin polycotton material, obviously for wear in the tropics, that makes sense. And the idea of having a thin polycotton material, of course, this is very fast drying. That's the idea behind this. You have two chest pockets here, as you can see, and these are bellows pockets, as you can see there. So they're not simple patch pockets. They do have a simple square pocket flap with a single button here. The buttons are basically of the battle dress type throughout. These are what a design of button you would have seen on later patterns of battle dress during the course of the Second World War, and then they appear on combat clothing in various uses through into the 1980s. The button closure down the front covers a zip, and we have a lightweight plastic zip behind here, as you can see, and that runs down to just here, just in line with the second to last button down the front there, as you can see. We'll see more detail of that when we turn this inside out. One feature of the early tropical combat uniforms, and something we'll have a look at in a bit more detail later on, is the very bright DPM finish. This is actually fairly close to what you would see on temperate DPM clothing of the time. There are much brighter examples of these, and I've never really found a satisfactory explanation for that. I think the higher contrast was intended for use in the tropics to a degree, but why there's such a variation in the colours, whether there were simply issues with dyeing the polycotton cloth, I'm not entirely sure. So if anyone can provide further information on that in the comments, I'd be very interested to know. You do have a final button at the collar here, so in theory this can be buttoned right up to the collar, and you actually have a button on the collar itself. So again, in theory, the collar can be buttoned up around the neck for extra warmth, potentially at night if needed. As you can see there, we have the button and the buttonhole there. So that can be buttoned together if required. The uniform is otherwise very simple at the front here. We have no lower pockets. This can be worn tucked in, but equally it can be worn untucked, and that was really the intention with this, at least initially, was that it would be worn untucked to allow for ventilation, but generally you do see these tucked in, so they are worn more as a shirt rather than a jacket, much as they are intended as a jacket. We'll start moving this around now and have a look at some of the other details. Moving around to look at the right side of the mannequin here, the right side of the jacket. As you can see, this is a little bit big for the mannequin. The shoulder should be out here somewhere, but it's sagging down a bit. But that does allow you to see the epaulette up on the shoulder here, again with one of the battle dress type buttons there, as you can see. So there's provision for wearing rank up on the shoulder there if required. The arm is otherwise plain in this instance, as this is an early tropical combat shirt. Later examples of these from the mid-1980s onwards would have the addition of a dressing pocket on the back of the arm and that would be carried across to the Desert DPM version of this uniform produced in cotton, which we've looked at previously on the channel. So that was a later addition to the design, but a minor alteration in the mid-1980s. Looking down at the cuff here, this doesn't have a gusset or anything, it's just, the sleeve just comes down here, and then you have a band sewn on to gather this in around the cuff if required, around the wrist. You can see here we have 2 buttons there for different points of adjustment, and you can button it on to either of those buttons depending on how tight you want to gather the cuff in around your wrist. So that's the right hand side of the mannequin there, the right hand side of the jacket. Very plain, not a huge amount to see there, just the detail of the sleeve construction. Moving on to look at the back of this, there isn't a huge amount more to see. We do have one very large panel to look at of this early DPM print. I'm a big fan of DPM, not just because I'm British, but it's also objectively a very effective camouflage pattern, and the early iterations of it are particularly nice in my opinion. The bleed over between the colours and so forth, you almost get an extra colour added in there, particularly between the tan and the green, and yeah, a very effective camouflage pattern, and I rather like this, I have to say. So that's one thing you do get from looking at the back, is you can see a full range of the different shapes and so forth in the DPM print there. Otherwise very plain, as I say. We'll move this around now and have a look at the left hand side. There's a little bit more to talk about. The same cuff design, we have the epaulette up on the shoulder there, as you can see. The feature we need to talk about here is the pen pocket on the arm. And as you can see, this sits just below the shoulder seam, basically at the midpoint of the arm there, angled slightly forward for ease of access, and you have a total of 5 compartments there to carry pens in across the pocket there, stitched in individually, as you can see. So a pocket specifically designed for carrying pens on the arm there. We'll turn this inside out now and have a look at the internal details and the label. Looking at the internal details of this, you can see various details of the construction. We have a double thickness of cloth at the front here where the buttons attach, and the same on the other side. And as you can see, the zip is offset underneath the button flap down the front there. So you've got this lightweight plastic zip, which we were talking about earlier as well. In these jackets, the label is found in the front, just below the bottom button there, as you can see, it's stitched in here. We'll have a look at this label in detail now. And as you can see, this is designated Jacket Combat Tropical, and you have there the NATO stock number, size 6 and a 1970s contract number, mid to late 1970s contract number there, and the manufacturer HE Textiles Limited. And then you have the care instructions at the bottom of the label as well. Other than the details of the stitching for the pockets and so forth here, there's not a huge amount more to talk about, so we'll start turning this around now and have a look at some of the other details. Looking at the right hand side of the internals here, which is of course the left hand side if you were wearing this the right way out, we have the shoulder seam coming down here, details of the stitching for the pen pocket on the arm here, and an interesting detail of the construction. Due to the band of cloth sewn on around the outside to allow for the cuff adjustment, this is actually turned over outward and then stitched down, so you don't have that turned over section of cloth at the end of the cuff here, apart from here at the back where that band of cloth isn't present, and that's where the tab is stitched on. As you can see here, basically where that band comes to an end, you've then got this piece of cloth stitched over here, or you've got that edge of the cloth is then stitched over on itself there. So just an interesting detail of the construction. I hope I've explained that clearly enough, but as I say, otherwise most of this is a single thickness of cloth. Obviously for wearing the tropics you want a nice lightweight garment, and that's what's been the aim of the design of this, really, is to have a single layer of cloth as much as possible, apart from where strengthening of the design requires. Looking at the back here, you can see the consistent bleed through of the colour through the cloth, so you get quite a strong camouflage print on the inside of this as well. And one detail to mention here is the hanging tab up in the collar here, which is included as part of the design, as you can see there. Looking at the left hand side of this, there isn't a huge amount more to see. I will just lift the arm up here so you can see some further details of the construction. We have the side seam here, obviously the inner seam of the sleeve there, the seam where this joins the body of the jacket, and the outer seam of the sleeve there, as you can see, and then the shoulder seam coming up there, which we've already seen. So just a few details of the construction there for those who are interested in that sort of thing. And that is the left hand side of the jacket. Basically finished looking at this now. We'll move on to look at the trousers from this uniform. We'll next have a look at the trousers from this uniform, and you can see an example of these here. As I remember from the label on these, I think these are very early 1980s as opposed to 1970s issue, but nevertheless the same pattern, and you can see again a slightly brighter DPM shade here a slightly brighter version of the DPM, the colours are a little bit brighter, and we'll see a further example of this with another shirt a little bit later on, which is a more stark example of how bright the DPM colours could get on this tropical combat clothing. We have a button fly here, along with a lightweight zip. If I undo the top button here, you can see there we have the button fly with the lightweight plastic zip underneath, and we'll have a look at more of the features, the draw cord and so forth, when we turn these inside out. The buttons throughout are a smaller version of the battle dress type buttons, so the same sort of dished plastic button as you see elsewhere in this khaki or olive drab, more of an olive drab colour than khaki. And you can see we have buttoned belt loops here at the front, and we have one on each hip as well, as we'll see as we move this round. There's one there and one there, and one in the centre at the rear as well. Turning these side on, we can see the leg pocket, and the legs are a mirror image as far as these side pockets are concerned. These are again bellows pockets, as you can see there, with again the simple square pocket flap and the single button in the centre there. Again, these smaller battle dress type of buttons, as you can see there. We do also have a hip pocket here, as you can see, and that side belt loop on the hip as well. And then you have side adjusters here, which have two buttons to allow for some adjustment of the waist. There's another one of those on the other side as well, as we'll see in a minute. And you can see down to the hem there, there is a channel for a draw cord in the bottom of these as well, which we'll see when we turn these inside out. The other leg is a mirror image in terms of the leg pocket, but if we look at the back of these, you can see the central belt loop there and the adjusters on each side. There is a single hip pocket on the rear of the right hip here, as you can see. This is a simple patch pocket with the squared pocket flap again, as you can see there. You can see the details of the seams and so forth there as well, details of the construction. We'll turn these inside out now and have a look at the interior details. Looking at the inside of these, you can see the bags for the internal pockets are made of DPM cloth as well. These are the bags for the hip pockets here. You can see the draw cord that's included at the waist here. This is sort of a mesh material, a mesh draw cord. This would come to be used in the Soldier 95 clothing as well later on. And you can see in the earlier 90s combat clothing as well, it was carried across to that design as well. The draw cord is simply made around at the waist there, and this is a useful feature. Earlier patterns of tropical combat uniform had taken account of weight loss amongst troops serving in the jungle due to limited resupply and the amount of energy burned on jungle operations, by having a crossover belt design so that the waist could be adjusted in evenly on each side without the cloth bunching up. In this instance, we have the draw cord, which allows for that adjustment beyond what you can adjust in using the side adjusters on these. So that's a good feature of the design, and so, as I say, something that will be carried forward to future designs of combat clothing. You can also see down on the legs here, if we turn these side on, where you can see various examples of reinforcement stitched in here. You have reinforcing pieces where the buttons stitch through, and you have a reinforcement here where the pocket flap attaches on as well. This is due to these being made of a very lightweight polycotton, so having the reinforcement is necessary to ensure these are strong enough to withstand jungle use in jungle and tropical environments. So you have that reinforcement there for the pocket flaps, for the buttons here. For the rear here, you can see you have the reinforcement for the pocket flap on the rear hip pocket there as well, and that's moved us round to the back now. We can see here the label as well, and we'll get a close-up look at this and just have a look at the details on the label here. And you can see this label, much as the top has been cut off a little bit, you can see trousers combat tropical, and then you've got the size there, size 11, and then you have the manufacturer under there, which is a little bit unclear to see, and you have the contract number underneath that, CT4B, and something possibly 101, 107. That's an early 1980s contract number, but obviously still with the pre-metric sizing, as you can see here. And again, you have the washing and care details at the bottom there as well, as you can see. The final thing to look at with these is the channel for the draw cord at the bottom of the leg there. You can see we have a channel worked in there. The bottom of the leg, you have a stitched in eyelet here, and another one around here. So you could run a draw cord through there to draw in the bottom of the trousers if required. And that's a look at the inside of the trousers. This is just an additional sort of section to the video to show you just how garish the early tropical DPM could be. On the right here we have the shirt which we looked at on the mannequin, and this is fairly standard. It's not unusual to see the 1968 pattern combat uniform in similar colours to this. This example, however, is another example of a 70s era shirt, And as you can see, it's extremely bright in terms of the colours used. The green is almost a mint green. The brown has turned to an orangey reddy colour. You've got a very yellowy sand colour, and you've got a slightly faded black. I think it's fair to say this has faded a little bit, but the black has almost a slightly purplish hue to it. And just contrasting these two, I thought would be of interest to show you just how garish the colour scheme on the DPM that print on the Tropical Combat uniform could be at this time. And these are quite sought after, the particularly bright day glow DPM. Some may think this is one of the more modern Dragon reproduction. I think it was Dragon that manufactured reproduction Tropical Combat uniform. It isn't, it is an original, but Dragon got pretty close to this colour scheme. It's not quite right, but they got pretty close to this colour scheme with their reproductions of the Tropical Combat uniform. And yeah, it really is quite bright and quite garish, as you can see. And the final thing to have a look at here is the hat which accompanied the Tropical Combat uniform. This is basically the final version of green jungle hat, but manufactured in the new polycotton, but manufactured in the new DPM polycotton. So the design, in terms of the foliage loops, the eyelets and everything, and the features inside, which we'll have a look at in just a minute, are basically per the last production version of the jungle green drill hat, and just manufactured in the new DPM cloth. So the design didn't really advance in that regard. It had already arrived at this basic design, just manufactured in DPM. You can actually see there's a difference in the colour of the DPM, in the sides and the top, and also the band around for the foliage loops here as well. Slight variations in the cloth there, just something to a point of interest to raise, I guess you could say. You can see here you have the high crown, the eyelets here, the mesh eyelets in common with the preceding designs. Foliage loops, as already mentioned. A little bit of damage to this, unfortunately. It is missing one of the eyelets from use. I would like to replace that if possible. It would be nice to repair this, but it functions perfectly well without, of course, and I suppose there's a little bit of the history of the hat, I guess, that it has lost this through use. You have the stitched rim, as you can see there, and then inside we have the feature carried across from the later version of the jungle green hats are these tabs here for attaching a chin cord, cord which we have here. And this is a nylon example with a plastic toggle. I don't believe these came fitted as standard. I think this has been fitted, but I could be wrong on that, and I'd be happy to be corrected if I am. You have metal eyelets in this instance. I think the example I have, the jungle green example I have, which has these fitted, has a stitched in eyelet, so that's another little change. Brass crimped eyelets there for the attachment of a chin cord. And then we do have a label in this at the back here, which is rather faded, but not entirely faded, so we can see the details here. Simply the size 7 1/8 there, and you can see we have the NATO stock number, the manufacturer, and then the contract number underneath there, which is probably a late 70s, looking at a late 70s contract number. So hopefully you can see that clearly enough there. So that's a look at the hat which accompanied this uniform, and with that, that's basically the end of looking at this Tropical Combat uniform. The hat was the final part of it to match the new shirt and trousers. So I do hope you found it interesting looking at this. As I say, Britain's first DPM Tropical Combat uniform. There would be various versions of this going forward, and it would be slightly modified during the course of the 1980s, and then in the 1990s you'd have a slightly modified version made of a new material, often referred to as tea bag. But that's something for a future video perhaps. Of course, from the mid-90s onwards you have the new line of Soldier 95 clothing coming into use, and that had its own tropical elements or lightweight elements as part of that design. So this uniform, introduced in the 1970s with some modifications, was in use right the way through into the 1990s. I do hope you found it interesting looking at this, as I always say. If you have found this interesting and you'd like to see more from the channel, please do consider subscribing if you haven't already. And whether you're newly subscribing or you've previously subscribed, please do make sure you hit the little bell, the notification button down below. That will of course alert you when I upload future videos. If you really like my uploads and you would like to support the channel, you can. Both Patreon and PayPal are linked down below. And as ever, a huge thank you to everybody who supports the channel using those two methods. It really is greatly appreciated. Thank you all very much indeed. If you'd like to follow the channel on social media, you can. Facebook, Instagram and Twitter are all linked down below. And if you'd like to get in touch and you don't really use social media, there is of course an email address down there in the description as well. That's everything for this video. So until next time, Bye for now.